usually the highest functioning of the bunch were schizophrenics, but they couldn't stay functioning for very long. You know, and the only way they knew to treat them back then, and this was back in the 70s, was with these drugs, you know, these antipsychotic drugs. And that's what they used. And
these are really strong drugs as well, aren't they, Jerry? I've heard they're very damaging. A massive list of side effects, etc. So how very sad.
Yeah, the side effects are horrendous. They're awful. And you're right, they're very damaging with long-term use. They rot out the brain and destroy the peripheral nervous system. But of course, I've never seen a psychiatrist ever explain to any patient the full effects of these drugs and how dangerous they were. So it started coming out. Some of the researchers in some of the universities started finding that autopsies of schizophrenics, their brains were shrunk like walnuts. You know, they were just rotted out. And it was schizophrenic after schizophrenic after schizophrenic. So they said, well, you know, the only difference between these guys and anybody else is they're taking these antipsychotic medications, these major tranquilizers. And they brought that up. And of course, the psychiatric mafia and big pharma went nuts. Oh, no, it's not our medicines. No, it's not.
Never
they went nuts. Never their fault. You know? So what the researchers did is they started feeding these antipsychotic drugs to rats and monkeys. And they found that it was the same result. These drugs were doing damage, you know, irreversible damage to these patients. You know, of course, I've never seen a psychiatrist ever explain this to them. Yeah. You know, they never went over the side effects. I've seen them say, oh yeah, it'll give you dry mouth, you'll have blurry vision, you'll get used to it in a couple of weeks, you'll feel a little bit groggy for a while, and then they go, they come back in 2 weeks and we'll see how you're doing. That was it, time after time after time after time. But that's all they had back then in the 70s. There wasn't anything else that worked. You know, regular psychotherapy of any kind just would bounce off them like water off a duck's back. Had no effect whatsoever. So we would use that. And what we had at the psych rehab center was, you know, on my ward was if they blew their medications 3 times, if they stopped using 3 times and got psychotic the 3rd time, that was like, okay, strike 3, you're out, you know, and we discharge them from the program. Because if they couldn't stay on the meds, they're not going to stay sane and they're not going to be able to hold the job. So what we do is replace them with somebody who we thought would stay on the meds. And then I found, I mean, there was all these things that I was seeing that just didn't mesh with what I was taught in graduate school. You know, what I was seeing with my own eyes didn't mesh. It just didn't belong. And one of the things was these people going off their meds. And so that was one of the first thing I investigated. Well, why are they doing that? Why are they choosing to go crazy? That's what it looked like to me. They go off their meds. They're choosing to go crazy. They've gone off their meds numerous times before, and every single time they went nuts. They went psychotic. So I start,
isn't it? Because like, why would they want to put themselves into a position where their mental health is apparently deteriorating by going off the meds?
Yeah, that's the first thing that came to my mind. Why are they doing this? You know, so I started questioning them. You know, like yeah, I saw what some of those psychotic breaks looked like, and they were awful. I mean, it was like hell on earth. You know, it was just terrible. So I started asking them, why'd you go off your meds? First thing out of their mouth was, well, the side effects are awful. You know, I couldn't stand the side effects. And then I'd ask, you know, the staff, why do they go off the meds? You know, and some of the answers I got were crazy. It was like one psych nurse said, oh, that's just one of the symptoms of schizophrenics. That's just one of the things they do. You know, but why do they do it? Who knows? They just do that. That's what they do. That's what schizophrenics do. They're crazy. They do these things. And I'm like, what kind of answer is that? But the major answer I got from both the schizophrenics themselves and the staff were the side effects. And no doubt the side effects were awful. But when you compare those side effects to what florid psychosis is like, there's no comparison. The psychosis, from my point of view, the experience I had was much worse than the side effects of the meds.
Yeah. So from someone looking on, isn't that interesting?
Yeah. So I'm like, okay, let me confront them with this. So everyone that went off their meds, I'd pull them in my office after they were put back on their meds and they were back to sanity again. And I'd say, why'd you go off their meds? They'd say, I hated the side effects. Expecting that. I said, okay. I gave them a blank piece of paper. I said, write down all the side effects you had from this meds. And they didn't all have the same side effects. So they were different. They'd write down, 4 or 5 nasty side effects. And then I went to the DSM and I got all the symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, all the ugly symptoms, the hallucinations, the suicidal ideation, the horrible voices telling them to kill themselves, running them down, nightmares, all the nightmare, 2 pages of nightmarish garbage, that they would go through. And I made a check sheet out of that. And I'd give that to them and I'd say, here, check each one of these symptoms that you've had when you went off of meds. And they checked all these. And then I handed them both back and I said, which one's worse? And they'd said, well, the schizophrenia is worse. And I said, then why did you go off your meds? You know what the answer was?
What?
For 3 solid years. 3 solid years, the same answer. I don't know. So I'm going, if they don't know, then who the devil does? And it's like, they've got to know the answer. One of them has got to know the answer. Right? So 3 years, I asked them the same question over and over and over again. And it took like 7 years to get the answer to that one.
Wow.
By the time I was about ready to leave the psych hospital and go to a PhD program, it came out just like a month before that. So it kind of took me by surprise. So what I noticed when I first got to the state hospital was that the psychiatrists, the schizophrenics, were beating the crap out of the psychiatrists. I mean, psychiatrists were being assaulted at a rate far in excess of any of the other staff members, except for attendants that were on the wards with these people for 24 hours a day. And they were only seeing these guys like 20 minutes every month. Wow. So I'm going, what's the deal there? Back then we didn't have cell phones. We had the regular dial-up phones. So the news, the hospital news would circulate in what they called the food factory. It was a big factory where they prepared food for all these units throughout the hospital. I mean, it was like an industrial plant. And there was a staff dining room there. And we would go eat there during lunch because there wasn't anywhere else to eat. And, this place was in the middle of nowhere. There was one mom and pop hospital in the entire town at that time. We had to drive 30 miles to go to a McDonald's in Macon, Georgia. So the food factory was where we ate the most.
The only choice.
Yeah, one of the few choices. And that's where the news of what was happening throughout the hospital would circulate. That, hey, this psychiatrist got his clock punched by a schizophrenic on this unit, and then over here and over here, and they were getting beat up at a rate that was just horrendous. And I'm like, well, what are they doing to piss these people off in 20 minutes a month?
Yeah.
It usually takes a little bit of time to for them to piss somebody off and get slugged, and that was a puzzle. So 7 years in, and I'll go back and retrack. So this isn't following the linear path that I found this stuff on. So it was 7 years in, I still didn't know why these people were going off their meds. And I still didn't know why psychiatrists were getting the crap beat out of them by schizophrenic patients. That's 7 years I spent there and still didn't know the answers to those questions. So one day one gal who was doing good in cosmetology, she stopped taking her meds and she lost it. She was down in the cosmetology lab screaming and hollering and, beating off demons. And, I got a call from the instructor, come down and get her out of here. So, took her out of there, and that was her third time. So she was notified we were going to discharge her. And she told her mother, and her mother called me. Her mother was down in South Georgia. And she said, please don't do that. I can't handle her. I can't deal with her. I need help. I don't I'll come, let me come up and talk to you, and we'll see if we can't talk some sense into her. And I felt so sorry for this mother. I said, okay, come on up, come on up next Friday, and I'll bring her in, and we'll see if we can find out why she kept going off her meds. So the mother's there that Friday. I'm there. The patient comes in, and the mother's asking her, they're going to discharge you. Why'd you go off your meds again? And I said, yeah, why'd you go off your meds again? You were warned. The third time you were out of here, and you went off them anyway. And she said, you won't believe it. You won't believe it if I told you. And I said, try me. I've heard some really weird stuff working here. I don't think you can tell me anything's going to freak me out.
Okay.
And she said, okay, all right. And she said, the voices told me that the psychiatrist was poisoning me with these meds, and that the side effects were the results of the poison. And that was exactly true. I mean, the side effects are toxic effects of these drugs, and those drugs are toxic. So there was some truth to that. And then it clicked to mind, like, why the psychiatrists were getting their clocks clicked by the schizophrenics. If the voices were telling them the same things they're telling her, and convincing them that the psychiatrist was poisoning them, then of course they'd attack them. And it wouldn't take a lot to set them off. So that kind of fit in. So I started asking other schizophrenics if that was the case, and a lot of them said, yeah, the voices are telling me that the psychiatrist is poisoning me. And I've heard that over and over again, but I didn't make anything of it until this. So that clicked into place. But other things that didn't click into place was nobody was interested. It was very clear that the voices were driving schizophrenic behavior. They'd sit there and they'd argue with the voices. You'd hear them walking down the hall, arguing with the voices and fighting with the voices, and the voices telling them to escape the hospital or to attack somebody. I mean, it was clear that whatever these things were, they were behind the patient's behavior. But everybody was brainwashed into believing that the voices were hallucinations, and these guys were just totally nuts, that their behavior made no sense, and there was no way to make any reasonable deductions about what they were doing. They were just flipping crazy. That's all there was to it. And they all believed that.
Yeah, it really puts those people in a position of they're not being helped, are they? It's like medication is the only answer. These people are suffering from illusions. Just leave them be, just manage them. Like you said, they're all tranquilizers, these medications. So it's almost like they're just being turned down. It's not really
That's right. They're just being drugged up. It's a control mechanism, and those drugs are really expensive. And they weren't working. So even though they were taking those drugs, even though it calmed them down where they could function somewhat, they were still hearing the voices. Most of them were. It was very rare for the voices to disappear totally. They were still there. But they weren't as strong, and they weren't as persistent, and they could sleep. The voices would keep them up at night where they couldn't sleep. So I'm like, well, why isn't anybody curious about what the voices are telling these people? Why isn't they asking them questions? Nobody was asking them anything about what the voices were saying and what part they played in their behavior. It was there was probably over 1,000 staff there. And not one of them was curious about that, except for me.
You were the only one using your eyes. Everyone else seems to have been indoctrinated by, their studies and where they work.
Oh, yeah. It's like, oh, yeah, we were taught in school that these were hallucinations, and so that must be the truth.
And it was in a book.
Yeah, it was in a book, and it was coming from professors, which is, I didn't trust the books or the professors. So you look at these psych books, and you look at the references in the back. This guy got this information from this guy, who got it 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 from this guy, from some guy who did an experiment 10 years ago. And it's like, oh my God, it reminded me of these little fish I was watching scuba diving one day. It was like they had these little piles of pebbles in the bottom of the ocean, and they would stick their heads up out of those pebbles. And when one went to steal a pebble from another one went and stole one of his pebbles and brought it back to his thing. And this guy stole the pebble from this guy. And I must have spent a whole tank of air watching this. I was just fascinated, and I didn't know why. I had no idea why. I was just mesmerized by this little community of fish that were stealing rocks from each other. And the only ones that were bringing in fresh material were those on the very outskirts of the community, who would go out into the ocean by themselves and grab a pebble and then bring it back to their nest, which would then be stolen by these other guys. So, and I had no idea why I was so fascinated with this, none. But I burned an entire tank of air watching these guys. And then when I saw that in the back of the psych books, in college, that's what it was. They were all they were doing the same thing the fish were. They were getting information from each other, and nobody was bringing it in from the outside. They were just, it was like incest relationship.
Yeah. It really explains why so little has changed in that field of psychology and psychiatry in such a long time, doesn't it?
They just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, and nothing. I mean, the two things that I saw that worked were well, they had a labeling system in abnormal psychology, but I later found out that DSM, that labeling system, all these psychiatric diagnoses, they're completely made up. There is not a single test in existence for any of those psychiatric diagnoses. Not one. There's not a lab test. There's no EKG, EEG, nothing. They're completely made up by this group of psychiatrists who meet in what was described as like a tobacco barn auction, where one guy comes in, he goes, "Hey, I got a new psychiatric diagnosis, and these are the traits," and they bring it up in front of everybody, and then they all listen to it and go, "Oh yeah, that sounds reasonable. Well, okay, we'll make it a psychiatric diagnosis," and then they publish it in their manual with numbers and all these explanations of what it is, and it's just a description of a segment of human behavior. It's almost like they're making every segment of human behavior a pathology. It's some kind of sickness. I mean, the whole gamut of human behavior, they're turning into a sickness. And they need that because the insurance companies won't pay if they don't have a diagnosis with a number that looks official, that's agreed upon by this group of bozos who are making all this up. So it's a scam. It's a freaking scam.
And then these labels, Jerry, as well. So these labels really lead into their only solution, which is the pharmaceuticals.
That's right. And the pharmaceutical companies are behind all of this. They're behind all of it, just like they were behind this friggin' virus garbage. They've made billions of dollars on the sale of this trash that they are putting into people. And I just heard today that they're putting it into your cows over there in Australia. So it goes into the cow meat and milk. You guys need to do something. You need to do something quick.
Sleepy Australia. Yeah, it's just awful, the state that.
Oh yeah. It's about to blow over here. Any time now, it's going to blow. It's building. It's boiling.
Yeah, it really has to. People have to wake up and see it for what it is. But yeah, just speaking about the medications with schizophrenia, like my mother and her family line have a lot of schizophrenia within probably the 3 generations that I'm able to see. And through going through my own memories coming through in the last 6 months, I've uncovered that they actually are intergenerational abuse, really severe trafficking that's went back all of that way. And all of these people were severely medicated, just completely tranquilized their whole lives. My mum was put on a medication when she was just after she had my sister, because she was apparently diagnosed with postnatal depression and schizophrenia at that stage, and completely damaged her mind. Like, she's unable to be off medication. She's on better ones now, but it's so very sad that these are people that have suffered extreme trauma of child abuse, ritual abuse, and they're being tranquilized, and it's really taken away the opportunity for all of her family to even heal, because they've been so tranquilized and dulled down. They haven't been able to really heal through the emotions, and I that's their choice too. They probably were afraid when it was coming up. A doctor said to them, take this, but they're now at the point where they really can't live without medication, and it's so very sad that that is pushed, especially when we know these are quite often survivors of some sort of childhood trauma as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's passed, the abuse is passed from generation to generation, and it's the abuse that causes this. It's the trauma that causes it. And the more trauma that you have built up on top of one another, the more likely you are to start hearing voices and become psychotic. And in the prison, I would look up some of these, some of the criminally insane records, and some of the horrible things they did. And then when you look back at their family and how they were treated, I mean, it was awful. It was just awful. Some of the ways they were treated. So there's trauma behind all this, and the medications don't cure anything. None of these psychiatric medications cure anything. They just suppress psychiatric symptoms. And like you said, with schizophrenics, it just tamps it all down. It just blurs it all out, but the trauma is still there. The damage is still there, and they can't get to it because they're narcosized. I mean, they're just, they're out of it. That's what's so good about the MACE energy method. It can get in there to that trauma very quick, and it can dispel it, and it works. And the only reason it does is because it takes into account the spirit of the person. None of these other psychotherapies take into account spirit. We're energetic beings. Thoughts are energy. Your mind is energy. Your spirit is energy. Completely ignored by psychiatry and psychology. Completely ignored. And we're spiritual beings.
Yeah. And we know with ritual abuse and MK Ultra, the people perpetrating the abuse are aware that, there is a complete spiritual dimension, and a lot of that abuse is actually done through, black magic, spells, etc., curses to attach these entities. Yet our standard medical system, psychiatry, psychology, doesn't ever stop to consider, anything other than the physical level. So it's really not getting down to releasing these deep-seated traumas that have been very deliberate.
Yeah. And, you look, I mean, thought drives everything. I mean, there's a thought before any action, except maybe if you stick your hand on a hot stove or something. But they completely ignore the dimension of thought and spirit. I mean, thoughts are energy. Trauma is frozen energy, and they don't take that into account at all. It's like, you look at the different forms of energy. You look at magnetism. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't feel it, you can't touch it. It's not amenable to the senses. For all practical purposes, you can't see or sense a magnetic field until you get a jar of iron filings, and then you can see it. You can see that energy, and that energy is pure. Electricity is the same way. You only see it by its effect. Gravity is the same way. You can't see it, smell it, touch it. You can see the effects of it. Well, the same thing is true with psychosis and the effects of psychosis. So schizophrenia has, it's an energetic illness. You know, you can't see those voices. You can't touch the voices. The regular guy can't hear the voices. You know, they're virtually undetectable except by what the person says. And psychiatry's got that covered by saying, you know, you're a whacked out psychotic, you're hallucinating. So we're not listening to anything you say. However, if you start studying, you know, those effects, it's as if you get a magnet and here's psychiatry dumping a bottle of Thorazine on top of that magnet, trying to get rid of that magnetic field by putting medicine on top of it, physical medicine. It's useless. So if you look at the effects of the voices, okay, the patterns they run, there's a big series of them. And these are the visible effects of the invisible voices.
Yeah.
Right? And
causing their
number one is right. So these are the effects of this illness, you know, this invisible illness, these voices that they can't see. You know, they try to call it a disease, but it's not a disease because there is no physical manifestation of it. They haven't found the schizophrenia germ. They haven't found anything wrong with the brain of these people. There is no chemical imbalance. And they still pushing that today, even after it's been disproved over and over and over and over again. The drug companies are going, you look at their advertisements, oh, it is believed it's due to a chemical imbalance in the brain, which our drugs somehow correct temporarily. You know, it's a crock of crap. And they're making what, $34 billion a year just in the United States selling these toxic drugs, and they're charging more for them than here in the U.S. It costs about $1,000 a month to stay sane. You know, between the psychiatrist appointments and the cost of these medicines.
It's so unreachable for so many people as well.
Yeah, that's why there's so many homeless people, you know, on the streets here. Yeah. They kicked out, they destroyed the state hospitals system in the US. It's too expensive. It's too expensive. So they dumped these guys. They said, oh, we're gonna get these guys to go to mental health centers. So they created these mental health centers and then withdraw the funding from them. And the schizophrenics wouldn't take their medications even when they were in the state hospital. They would cheek them and spit them out later. What makes them think that they are going to go out of their way to go to a mental health center? Most of them don't have transportation, and pick up these toxic drugs that screw them over, you know, and don't cure anything. Yeah. So it's turned into a friggin' disaster. It's a fiasco. It's a giant merry-go-round where with each revolution, they're bilking the insurance companies and the patients and their families and you know, whoever else is paying for these drugs, you know, tens of thousands of dollars, yeah, with every cycle, you know, and they go off their meds, they bring them back into the emergency room, they put them back on their meds in the psych hospital, they stay sane for a couple of months, and then they go off them again, and then it just goes round and round and round, over and over and over. Nothing's being cured. The insurance companies are being fleeced of $34 billion a year, that's in just medication costs. So in the US, it costs close to $1,000 to stay sane for a month with the medications and the office visits and all that kind of crap. You go across the border to Mexico, you know, just on the other side of the border, these same companies are selling these same drugs, you know, with Spanish labels, you know, from the same companies for $75 a month.
You can't tell me that it's,
you know, and it's illegal for you to bring them across the border into the United States. The drug companies are horrendously, you know, you talk about psychotics. These guys are psychopaths. They're friggin' psychopaths. You know what they're doing to people, and the people don't. They believe what they're saying. They believe over and over again. You know, so they make up all these fake diagnoses. They publish them in this big official looking book with all these, you know, fancy names and all this psychobabble and these numbers, and they teach this in the colleges and the medical schools with the psychiatry as if it's a Bible, you know, and they're still teaching that it's a chemical brain imbalance in the institutions. So the institutions are in league with big pharma, who paid them off to teach this garbage. Yeah. But when you look at the,
wasn't it just like you said, an endless cycle, and we've just been smashed with propaganda from this so-called science.
And they're the experts, you know, they're the and they're so arrogant. They're so friggin' arrogant. You know, we're the doctors.
Yeah.
You
Don't
know,
ask questions.
Don't ask questions. You know, and that's the same way it was in the PhD program. You don't ask questions. You know, here I was 7 years in the state hospital, and I was seeing that what they were teaching me was a crock of crap. And you know, as I started asking questions, they get pissed off. You know, I went, you know, I couldn't deal with it. I just couldn't deal with it. So when you look at what the physical manifestation of this invisible disorder, because it's not a disease. There is no schizophrenia germ. There is nothing physical that they have found. Nothing. They haven't found any chemical imbalance. They haven't found any genetic anything. But they went with that for years and years and years. They blamed it on mothers for decades. Oh, it's the mother's fault. It's what she ate. It's what she did. It's what she said, you know, over and over. So there are a series of patterns that these things run. And anybody who works with schizophrenics can see this with their own eyes, you know. So you don't need to do any kind of scientific test. The number one characteristic of the voices is that they're consistently negative. They say nothing positive. They're always running down the person. They're derogatory, insulting, abusive, and destructive. You know, they may start out as positive, you know, like, oh yeah, we're special. We're special spirits. We can help you. We got special powers. But soon they turn on the person.
Wow.
You know, you can't believe anything they say. So when I started seeing that pattern, that was one of the first patterns I saw, was they were negative. They were always telling the patient awful things about themselves and everybody else, you know, consistently. And I'm like, well, what is it that holds these voices to such a consistent negative pattern? You know, there's got to be something that doesn't let them drift, you know, that keeps them on that negative route.
Excited.
And I remember watching a movie once, I think it was called The Enemy Below, where a destroyer was chasing a German U-boat, and the German U-boat was crippled, and the destroyer was trying to blow it up. And every time it would escape, it would turn onto a certain course heading back to Germany. You know, so the captain of the destroyer figured that out. So every time he lost the U-boat, he would turn to that course and pick him up again. So that reminded me of the same thing, the negativity. What holds that hallucination, so they say, to such a negative course? And if it is running a pattern, it can't be a hallucination, because hallucinations are random. They're positive, they're negative, they're all over the place. And I've seen my share of them in what I've done. You know, the second thing that made no sense is that the voices were anti-religious. Patient after patient after patient would tell me they don't like me reading the Bible. They don't like me going to church. You know, when I get near a preacher, they drive me away. And I noticed that when, you know, at the psychiatric rehab center where I was working, the chaplain would have an ice cream social, you know, once a month or something like that. And all the patients would come down, and ice cream and cake were hard to come by there. So all the patients would go down, they'd have a good time, and they'd play music and just socialize. But the schizophrenics on my ward would never go down there. None of them. And the first time I saw that, I went, that's odd. You know, that's odd. So I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. Second time it happened, there they are again. So third time I started asking questions. You know, why aren't you going down there? Why aren't you with the other guys having ice cream and cake? Why aren't you listening to music and having fun? You know, oh, there is no God. I don't like preachers. The Bible's a bunch of crap. You know, it was all negative, anti-religious stuff. And then I noticed the kind of stuff that they were reading on their bedstands. It was like murder mysteries and war stories and all this negative crap. So I'm like, well, that's odd. And then later on, one patient told me, that when they repeated the 23rd Psalm, and I'm not a religious fanatic by a long shot, you know, but this guy told me when I repeat the 23rd Psalm, the voices reacted like they were thrown onto a hot frying pan.
Wow.
And I'm like, that's interesting. And then I ran into another one who said the same thing. And then I started passing that out, you know, saying, hey, when the voices come, repeat this. So what I did was anything to piss off the voices, I would tell them to do more of it.
Yeah.
You know, and then I would start asking questions about what happened. You know, and I would ask them, what are the voices telling you? What did they do when you repeated the 23rd Psalm? You know, and then one day, one of them went to a psychiatrist and told him that I was handing out the 23rd Psalm and I was asking questions about their voices, and that he didn't much like it. It was his voices didn't much like it. I ended up in front of the medical director, you know,
Wow.
being told the voices are hallucinations. They are, you know, you're reinforcing them by asking these people questions. I want you to stop it right away. You know, I got enough troubles without you stirring them up more, you know. And at the state hospital, there was an unwritten, and I think it had to do with the psychiatrist being beat up. There was one unwritten rule that you don't do anything to stir these people up, you know, anything more than you have to. I mean, if you have to stop them from acting out or something like that, okay, but you don't do anything else to, you know, stir them up, because you don't know what they're going to do. You know, you don't know when they're going to go off. So that was a real hamper. And then it happened to me a second time with another psychiatrist. Again, called up being told these are hallucinations. You're reinforcing the hallucinations by asking questions. But by then I got some answers that weren't adding up to their scenario. So I had to kind of go underground and be very careful about how much I asked and who I asked and how much pressure I put on them, you know, for answers, because, you know, they weren't allowing questioning, you know. And I really didn't get into the meat of the matter until I went to work for the psychology department of the state prison after I got out of the PhD program, where if a psychotic patient went to the warden or went to one of the counselors and said, hey, the psychologist guy is asking me questions about my voices and I don't like it, they'd go, oh, screw you, get out of my face. You know, get out of it, go away. You know, but it was there where I put together groups of patients, or you know, I guess you'd call them the criminally insane. And the agreement I had with them is that I'll do everything I can to help you and help you out in every way I can without getting into trouble. The deal is you have to tell me what your voices are telling you in real time when we're talking, you know. And for the 18 years I was there, I always had a group of these guys around that were feeding me information about the voices. And that's when things really started getting strange, when I learned enough about these patterns to start interfering with them. But I don't want to go there yet. I still got the patterns here.
Wow.
So another pattern that these things run is that they foster and create negative emotion. They don't want the person to be happy. They don't want the person to do anything that makes them happy. They don't want them to do anything that's pleasant. They want them all screwed up. They want their head spinning. They want that negative emotion boiling up. They want them angry, anxious, upset. And they're constantly battering them with, you're no good, you're rotten, you're stupid, you're ugly, nobody likes you, they're talking behind your back. It's a pages and pages of that kind of crap. And the voices are telling them, if you tell anybody what we're saying, they're going to lock you up. They're going to increase your medicines. Wow. And unfortunately, that's true. That's true.
So these parasitic entities are literally generating negative energy in their host to feed off. They're making them feel really bad.
Right. That's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah. And that's consciousness, isn't it? You know, like it's changing, it's adjusting.
It's changing consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you talk to schizophrenics, they'll tell you, the voices ever tell you anything good? hardly ever. And if they do, they use it, they turn on them later, you know, so it's constantly negative. And another thing I noticed also with the schizophrenics at the state hospital is that after they were attacked by the voices, they were energetically drained, you know, and I found that odd, but probably for more than a decade, I thought that was due to the awful, negative, terrible stuff that the voices are telling them, you know. And
Yeah.
it's constant. It doesn't let up. It's always, you know, you're stupid, you're ugly. Well, why'd you do that? See how stupid you are. Da, 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 da. It's a constant battering, you know. And I thought, well, you know, if I was being constantly battered by negative voices telling me I was worthless and stupid and I should kill myself, and this was going on 24 hours a day throughout my waking day, yeah, I'd probably be drained too.
How it'd be
So
so
I just,
it would be so very challenging. Like I just, you know, and these are
oh yeah,
such the people that I know with schizophrenia are such sensitive people to energies and emotions and people, and just to have these voices, entities just in their ear being really negative, making them judge themselves, making them feel horrible, even to the point where they're making them feel suicidal. It would be just such a draining experience.
well, yeah, that's what I figured, and I figured that for about a decade, and um, I lost my train of thought there. I had a point, but yeah, I did notice that they were drained after they were being attacked.
And that would suggest that they're taking their energy through these,
I just thought, like you did. I thought, you know, if I was being attacked like that, I would be, you know, but what I was going to say was we're told from the time we're little kids that every thought that comes into your head belongs to you. Who else could it belong to? You know?
Yeah.
And then when these guys start hearing these thoughts that are telling them all these evil things, they think that belongs to them.
Yeah.
And they think I'm going crazy. Why am I thinking these things? And of course, you know, psychiatry and the colleges and everything are pushing the same thing. They're still being told every thought that comes into your head belongs to you. That's wrong. That's dead wrong. Until they realize that, they're never going to have a cure for schizophrenia. Those thoughts do not come from them. They are not of them. They're coming from somewhere else. And the intention is not their intention for themselves.
Yeah.
It's a destructive intention. You know, there's a divide there that needs to be brought out. And psychiatry and psychology are not bringing it out. If anything, they're obfuscating it. You know, so
yeah. I was going to say, Jerry, too, like in light of, you know, people realizing that not every idea or voice that comes into your head is yours. You know, we can even compare that to, you know, a lot of the military technology that's being used against people at the moment. So, you know, we've got targeted individuals with like voice to skull technology. We've got frequency weapons that are just making people feel horrible. Like I know over the city areas in Australia when I visited, I'm just like, get me out of here. Like I can do a week, but I'm just like, this is awful. Like it's just pressure, it's fear, it's negativity. And these are all things that are being put out over now all of us. And these people that have been, you know, termed as schizophrenics are very sensitive to energies as well. So, you know, there's a lot of things that we see now that actually show how energy is being used as a weapon against humanity. So it makes a lot of sense.
And they're doing it in the embassies. They're constantly doing that in the Cuban embassy. You know, the staff are coming out of there sick and they don't know why.
Yeah.
You know, and other embassies. So, you know, it was, I don't know, there's probably 2 decades later after I got out of the state hospital. I was working in the prison and I was still believing that, you know, that lack of that energy, because they weren't using the energy. They weren't, you know, they weren't physically using it. You know, so here they are tossing and turning in bed all night, and they get out of bed and they're telling me I feel as drained as if I was working in the hot sun all day with a pickaxe. This is what they're telling me. And the prisoners are telling me the same thing. So there was a one-to-one correspondence between being attacked by the voices and their energy levels dropping down to nothing. Yeah. And again, for probably 2 decades, I was thinking it was due to the abuse, the constant abuse. And then one day they put me over some of the most difficult units at the prison. And I don't know, I think part of that was for punishment. The other part was, I was adrenaline junkie. So I kind of in a strange way enjoyed it, but at the same time I didn't. So they put me over the jail for the prison. So this is where all the bad guys from the entire prison complex would go. This is the worst of the worst. We're going in there, the gangsters and the completely psychotic guys. And one day I came to work, and here was they called it inmate kite, an inmate letter was on my desk from this prisoner who was over in the CDU, the prison jail. And he's saying, "Hey man, there's this crazy guy in the cell with me. He paces the cell all night. He's talking to himself. He's arguing with himself. He's standing over me at 3 a.m, looking down at me. I wake up and he's standing there staring at me. He's going, I can't take this anymore. You got to do something." So I look up his record, and he was sent there for snitching off the Aryan Brotherhood, a drug deal. So he snitched off one of their drug deals. The prison got all their drugs. They broke up the gang and sent them to prisons all over the state. So it was a really hard hit for that gang. And they wanted this guy dead. They'd already stabbed him once, and he was in there for protective custody.
Wow.
But he's in here with that friggin' lunatic, and they wanted him dead so bad that some of the Aryan Brotherhood guys actually got into trouble so they could get thrown into that jail so they would have a chance to get at this guy. And they would only let him out with an escort. So, they didn't have the chance, but they were throwing notes under his door saying, "As soon as you come out of it, we're here. We're waiting on you. First chance we get, you're a dead man." And they'd be constantly throwing them under his door. And here he is in there with this flaming psychotic, with the gangsters throwing these notes under his door. You couldn't be under more pressure or more anxiety than this guy was feeling, and at the same time, here's his crazy roommate standing over him, 3 a.m. Who knows what he's going to do? And he's not on drugs, so he's floridly psychotic. And so he's locked in with a lunatic, a raving lunatic. So I go over there and I pull him out, and I watch him as he comes up the steps, and he's got plenty of energy. He bounds up the steps. He doesn't use the guardrails. His walk is brisk. He comes into the office. He sits down. He's erect. He's not slumping over. His speech is normal. It's coherent. There was no lack of energy. He was very, very. He was paranoid. He was anxious. He was somewhat depressed, but he wasn't like down and out. Like some of these schizophrenics who are being hit by the voices. So I get done with him, and I'm going, well, that's odd. You can't be under much more stress than he is, and he's got plenty of energy. So I watch him go down. He bounced down the steps, go back to his cell, and I have the guards bring up the psychotic guy. And he can barely make it up the steps. He's holding on to the guardrail. He's real slow. His speech his gait is very slow. He's dragging his feet. Comes into the office and he kind of slumps over. His speech is slow, somewhat incoherent, and no energy at all. And I asked him, "You hearing voices?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm hearing them bad. I'm hearing them real bad." And I said, "Well, how's your energy level?" He says, "I don't have any energy." And I looked at the comparison. It was a perfect experimental situation. They were both in the same cell. They were being treated by the same guards. They were in the same physical space. They were in the same condition. They were eating the same food. Everything was equalized. There couldn't be a more perfect experimental setup. And yet, the guy, who was stabbed and the gangsters were over had 3 or 4 times more energy than this unmedicated schizophrenic. So I walked out of there that day and I went, it's not the abuse, it's not the abuse. So, and then I go, well, what was it? You know, if it's not the abuse, what is it? There's a one-to-one correlation between the patients hearing their voices and they're being drained. You know, it happens almost every time. Now, they don't notice it because of all the turmoil going on in their head. But when you bring it up and say, well, have you noticed that you don't have any energy after the voices attack? They'll say, oh, yeah. And then you ask them, well, where do you think that energy goes? Well, I don't know. Well, did you use it? I mean, were you doing anything physical to use it? No, I was laying in bed all night tossing and turning. Well, that doesn't sound like you used a lot of energy doing that. You know, so it went there. So that's why they create that negative emotion. They are feeding on it. Now, I pushed that a little further. Now, this was, you know, still in the prison. And one of the group that I was working with, who was telling me what the voices were saying, we had these patterns, and I haven't finished telling you about them yet, but had those patterns, and we were working on disrupting those patterns. And the voices didn't like it. So I'd give these guys exercises. I said, okay, here, try this, see if it works. Come back in a week and tell me what happened. All right. So I would do that with all of them. You know, I'd give them something that I thought would work and then call them back in and see how it worked. You know, and if it didn't work, we'd go back to the drawing board and try something else. Anything that the voices didn't like, I told them to give them more of it. Now, what that did is that upset the voices.
Yeah.
And that made them more upset. But they could handle it. For the most part, they could handle it.
And I guess you were creating this environment then where your clients they're able to actually perceive that these voices were separate to them because they're taking action against them. Like when you say to someone, go and do this to the voice, they're realizing, okay, well, that's not me. That voice is something that
right.
I don't necessarily need to follow. Let's take action. So
yep. That's one of the primary things that therapists need to do is split off those voices from the person and let them know that these thoughts are not your thoughts. You know, why would you think about killing yourself? Why would you think that you're no good? Why would you think all these rotten things about yourself? You know, those aren't you. That's not you doing that. Once that happens, then they have an enemy that they can fight against. But if they're listening to the psychiatric mafia that say, no, your head's broken, you're just crazy, and that's all there is to it. You can't do anything about it. You know, you're helpless. All you can do is come to us and get these meds. It's like that Dante's Inferno where that big sign over hell says, all those who come here leave all hope behind, kind of thing. You know, they give them no hope.
Yeah.
Say, you're broken for the rest of your life. All you can do is come here and get our toxic drugs, you know, because we say so. You know, so you know, that progressed along those lines with as we became more and more successful at finding things that would disrupt these voices. The patients would start, the prisoners would start coming back and saying the voices are really getting pissed off with you. They don't like what you're doing. They don't like you doing this. Yeah. And it was one after another after another. And these guys, a lot of them didn't know each other. You know, it's a fairly big prison unit. They didn't know each other, you know, and they're all telling me the same thing. You know, yeah, the voices are really getting pissed off at you. They don't like this crap. They don't like doing this, you know, and said, yeah, give them more of it, you know? And so it went from there until one guy I was working with who was doing fairly well. We finished our session, and in the doorway as he's leaving, he turns around and he looks at me and he goes, you know what you're doing is dangerous, don't you? And I just, you know, I had never thought of it. It didn't cross my mind. It didn't cross my mind. So I'm like, I didn't say anything. I was kind of taken aback by it. I didn't feel any fear, but it got my attention. You know, that I didn't know how much attention to give it, but it got my attention. And then he turned around, he walks off. And I sat there thinking about it, going, well, the voices are in their heads. They're not in my head. They can't come out of there. They can't get me, you know? So I ain't worried about it. So I just continued, and this guy was getting better and better. And then one day, he comes to my office without an appointment, knocks on the door, and he goes, I open it up. I said, what's up? He says, the voices want to talk to you.
Wow.
And I'm like, they want to talk to me personally? That had never happened before. In like 25 years, that had never happened. It was always, oh, the voices are saying this, or the voices are saying that. And I would, voices are saying you're stupid and you're ugly and you're awful and you don't know what you're doing, or whatever the garbage they say. And I'd say, well, you go tell them to stick their head in the toilet or something. I mean, it was that kind of stuff. So, I'm taken aback by this again. So,
Yeah.
so here's this guy come back again. It's the same guy who gave me the warning. And I said, well, okay, come on in. Let's see what they have to say. So I sit down and he goes, I said, well, what do they have to say? And his voice changes a little bit. It gets a little deeper. And out of his mouth come these words: you have no right to interfere with our way of life, period. Our way of life. And then he goes, that wasn't me. That wasn't me. That was the voices. I didn't say that. And I said, no, you're shitting me. He goes, no, I'm not. I didn't say that. That was the voices said that. That was them, And I'm like, holy shit, that was like, boom, that was like, that was like a punch in the head.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I said the regular thing, like, who are you to tell me that when you're destroying these people? And that was over. So it was like, it went from a warning to a stronger warning to, then it was like maybe a month or two later, I was reading a book by Miguel Ruiz called The Voice of Knowledge. He's a shaman, and he was talking about entities that were similar to this, to talk to regular people, and I went, that's interesting. Because I'd bring stuff into the schizophrenics all the time. They said, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? What do you feel about this? I was always asking them questions, always, poking into their heads and seeing what I could get out of there. So I brought that in, and I had a paragraph where he was talking about how these voices were energetic parasites. And that's what I was seeing. That's exactly what I was seeing. So I bring that in, I highlighted that section of the chapter, and this guy comes in, and we start with some small talk, and I said, hey, I brought something in, I'd like your opinion on it. Tell me what you think. And I started reading this about, these things were energetic parasites, they were stealing their energy. And then I look up, and this guy's sitting there like frozen with this glazed look on his face, like a zombie look, like, I'm like, what the hell happened to him? And he's not saying anything. He's not answering my questions. He's just staring at me with this strange look, this cold, penetrating look. And I'm like, he's going to attack. So I push my chair against the wall. So if he does, he's not going to knock me over. Then at least I can kick him back. And then from behind my head comes this crackling, like an arc welder. It was like an electric arc welder. It's going crack, 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 crack. And I'm like, what the hell? And I turn around, and it starts moving up the wall to my left at a 45-degree angle up that wall. Crack, 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 just like an arc welder. But it's moving, and I don't see anything. I don't smell anything. I just hear it. And it's freaking me out. And I look at him, and he's just staring at me. And I asked him, I said, do you hear that? And he just stares at me with this blank stare. He doesn't say anything. So now I'm like trying to split my attention between trying to see whatever this thing was and keeping my eye on him, because I'm thinking he's going to attack any minute. He's acting really weird. So I'm like back and forth, trying to keep my eye on both these things. And then it cuts across the ceiling over his head, so I can see them both at the same time. I saw nothing. There was nothing there except this crackling electrical sound. And then it starts coming down the wall, right next to my leg, and it jumps into this Rubbermaid trash can right next to my leg, and it's crackling in there. And I look in the trash can, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. There's not even a paper there. The inmate porter had cleaned it the night before. There was nothing in there, you know. And I look there and I look at him, and he slowly gets up with this zombie look, and he goes, "I gotta leave." And he shuffles out of the office, and I'm like, "You gotta go, get out of here!"
Like, yeah, I'll stay in the office
and I'm like,
today.
don't, go.
Wow.
I didn't say anything, but I was. That was like being hit over the head with a baseball bat, you know, because I didn't think these things could cause any physical anything. And this was a physical sound, you know, and it lasted a good while. It was like, 25, 30 seconds. It wasn't short.
Yeah.
It just kept going and going and going. So it wasn't like I was hallucinating. It was there. And he left, and I didn't call him back for 2 to 3 months. Didn't want to see him. But after about 3 months, I was curious. I got to call him back. What the hell happened in there? What happened? So I call him back, and he comes in. He's looking good, and I thought he'd be devastated. I thought anything that could come out of him like that would certainly destroy him. And I'm shocked by how good he looked. I mean, he had lots of energy. He looked normal. I said, "You look good." I mean, I thought you'd be destroyed after what happened in here last time. And, we did a little bit of small talk, and I said, "Did you hear," he sat down, and I said, "Did you hear that crackling when you were here last time?" And he said, "Yeah, I did, but I was surprised that you did," meaning me. Mm-hmm. And I said, I heard it well. And I said, "What was that?" He said, "That was them." And I'm like, "Them who? The voices?" He said, "Yeah, those were the voices." And I said, "Well, what in the blazes were they doing? What were they doing?" He said, "They were trying to scare you off." And I said, "Well, they did a damn good job of it."
Yeah, exactly. Wow.
So
interesting.
I remembered that look he had on his face when he was leaving. And I said, what were they telling you as you left my office the last time you were here? And he said, "They were telling me to go get a shank and stick it in your gut." And the shank is a homemade prison knife. And I was going, he wouldn't do that. I've worked with him with 6 months. He's doing better than he ever had at the time that happened. He wouldn't do that. And I just went, "Well, why didn't you do it?" And he said, "I couldn't find one."
Oh, Jerry, it's a close call.
I know.
It just goes to show
and I'm
how
like,
powerful these energies are.
Whoa.
Yeah, I couldn't find one.
I couldn't find one. And nobody would give him one. So apparently. So yeah, they are negative entities. They're negative. They create the negative emotion to drain it. And that's what happens with depressed people. They're thinking all this negative stuff, and then their energy level drops to nothing. Even normal people, they're walking along sometime, and, nothing much is going on. Then they have this horrible thought just bolt into their head, like, "Why don't you stab that guy? Or why don't you jump over the bridge? Or why don't you drive your car into oncoming traffic? Or why don't you jump into the Grand Canyon or do something?" I mean, that happens. That's them. They hit us all.
Yeah, I've even had a couple of friends during the scamdemic that we've been through over the last few years. They were telling me how they heard voices of like, "Go and get the jab, take it, go along with it." So it's so interesting that, obviously the people that we see as schizophrenics have this to a much larger degree, but it definitely does affect us all at sometimes in our life.
Yeah, to different degrees. Every Sherry Sweeney who kind of cured herself of this stuff said that every negative thought about yourself or anybody else comes from the dark side. They're not your thoughts. They're coming in from somewhere else.
Yeah. And we're so conditioned through all the propaganda, aren't we, Jerry? To be negative, that you're not enough, you need to buy this, you need to do this, you need to fit in.
Right.
These aren't normal human characteristics. We've just been brainwashed since.
No. Your soul is perfect. It's energy. It's like a magnetic field. It's perfect. There's nothing wrong with it. All this other stuff is coming in from them or trauma that you picked up throughout life. And, you know, when you started talking about the voices telling them to go get jabs, did you see this recent series of videos of people who are dropping dead from the vaccine? They spin in a circle
Oh, I
and
haven't seen
they're
that.
grabbing at the air. Yeah, they're out there.
Oh.
It's come out within the last couple of days. They're spinning around. They're grabbing at the air like they're fighting something, and then they just keel over dead. And they all shrivel up into the same pose. It's like there's something demonic they're fighting before they collapse. It's really strange. It's very strange.
Oh. Wow, it's really,
Yeah,
sometimes it's realizing we are in such a spiritual war, and there's so many levels to their warfare over us. It's multi-dimensional, and by trapping so many of the masses in thinking this is 3D, it's just physical, you're just here to have a good time, do what you want. They're just not picking up, the magnitude of what's actually happening around us energetically as well.
No, they need to wake up. This is a spiritual battle.
Sure is. I found it so interesting. I found it so interesting how you were saying that the entities hated the Bible verses as well. That's quite.
Oh, they don't like them reading the Bible.
Yeah.
They don't like that. They don't like anything to do with religion. Matter of fact, when I was in the state hospital, I started questioning them when I saw this. And they broke up into 3 different categories. If the voices were weak when they went to a church, the voices would shut up when they went into church. If the voices were moderately strong, they would kick up and they'd start mocking the preacher and saying all this stupid stuff and kicking up so they couldn't hear what the preacher was saying. If the voices were real strong, they would get up and they would run out of the church. They were like they were being driven out, and that was after questioning scores of different schizophrenics who tried to go to church because they sensed that the answer was there somewhere. Yeah. So yeah, these things are energetically, they're, and I think it's at some level, that's why, this vampire stuff, Dracula stuff, reacts to humans at such a level, because that is what's happening to them spiritually. They're being drained energetically by these negative entities.
Yeah, we've got that unconscious awareness that there is an energetic war against us. It's just unseen for the most part until they start trying to rustle around in your office like you had Jerry.
Oh, I'll never forget that experience. And now some of the other patterns here. Now, you guys who work with schizophrenics or have schizophrenic families, I mean, you can see this for yourself. It's clear as day. All you got to do is open your eyes and look at it. They're very clear set patterns that these things consistently run repeatedly. They can't be hallucinations if they're running these set patterns. And another one of their patterns is they get louder after sunset. When the sun goes down, they get louder, they get more persistent. And if you look at that in the old folks' homes with these guys that are kind of demented, they call it sundowner syndrome. They start acting up after sunset consistently.
So interesting.
They get louder if you.
What are your thoughts about why it's after sunset?
Well, I don't know. You can ask the schizophrenics too. They'll tell you the voices get louder after sunset.
Yeah.
And they get loudest between 3 and 4 in the morning. Consistently.
3 and 4 in the morning is when a lot of energy workers feel that the veil between the unseen and the physical world is the thinnest as well, because of the temperature, and there's no sun at that time, sort of reflecting down the pressures, etc. So that's quite interesting that it's that time of the morning.
Yeah, and consistently, they'll virtually all of them will tell you that. Now, when patients complain to psychiatry about the voices, with the psychiatrists, I've watched them say this over and over. Oh, just ignore them. They're hallucinations. They're not real. Just ignore them. When you try to ignore them, they get louder and they get more persistent. And I remember I was sitting in an office when we were doing a meeting with one patient. This is the first time I ran into that. And I watched the psychiatrist tell him, oh, just ignore the voices. They're hallucinations. So I called that guy back a week later, just out of curiosity, and said, Well, I was there when the psychologist or psychiatrist told you to ignore your voices. How's that working for you? He said, it ain't working at all. He said they get louder after that. So then I started questioning others. So if one of them would tell me something about the voices, I wouldn't take that at face value. I'd have to have 2 or 3 of them say the same thing before I'd even consider it. And then I'd start questioning all of them. Every new schizophrenic that came onto the ward, I would put him through a whole series of questions, especially at the prison. So they get louder when they're ignored. They foster self-destructive behavior. So I saw that at the state hospital when, schizophrenics they'd be just about ready to graduate. They had all their courses done. Everything was fine. And then they do something to screw it up. It's where they get kicked out.
Like self-sabotage.
They would constantly self-sabotage themselves.
Yeah.
And that's the voices, not allowing them to succeed at anything.
Yeah.
They foster isolation. They don't want the person to be around anybody. They don't want them to be around family. They want them locked in their room by themselves, listening to the voices with everybody else shut out. They don't want them to have a girlfriend. They don't want them to have family or father or mother. They want them all to themselves. And that's the very worst thing you can do with a schizophrenic, is let them isolate themselves like that, because then the voices have complete access to them. There's no competition for their attention, none.
Yeah.
So don't do that. If you have a schizophrenic in your family, do not allow them to isolate themselves. It's a battle for their attention. It's who's going to control their attention, them or the voices. And I've seen them where they've completely taken over these people. I've seen 2 cases like that. The person who was originally there is no longer there. It's just this demonic, murderous entity, that's there then. They demand the attention of the victim. They're constantly after their attention. They maneuver for increased control over the victim constantly. They're trying to, I've seen them where they start off and they'll tell the patient, hey, go pick up that pencil, or go sit in that chair, or, hey, turn around and look at the wall. It's almost like somebody who bought a new car and is just learning how to drive it, is the impression I got with that. So, they're constantly after more and more control, because then they can get the guy to do stuff that gets himself in trouble. And if they can get him thrown into prison, that's a constant negative environment. Yeah. And that's a feeding trough for these things. They lock these people up. They destroyed all the state hospitals. They defunded the mental health centers. So how are these guys going to survive? They can't work. They got no place they can stay. So they start stealing stuff. They start using drugs. They start selling drugs, and then they get sent to prison. They're psychotic in the prison, and they're put into this, this flagrantly negative environment. This, with
stressful,
full of violence and bloodshed, and their emotions are killed by the time they get out of there. They're raving mad at what society is doing to them, and then when their sentence is up, they dump them back out on the street with $50 and say, okay, you're free. Your sentence is done. You've served your time, as if that did anything. Yeah. Rehabilitation programs virtually don't exist in the prisons. They're too expensive. And I've seen them release people from the prison that I knew were going to kill somebody within probably a matter of weeks. Oh, your time is up. You served your sentence. You're free. Yeah, walk out with $50. Call a cab. It's ridiculous. The prisons are Skinner. Close to 80 years ago or so, B.F. Skinner proved that punishment only suppresses abnormal behavior as long as it's sitting on top of the guy waiting to whack him. Soon as it disappears, that behavior goes up above baseline, comes back down to where it was, and just continues. And that's all prison is punishment. It does not work. Yeah. They proved it over almost a century ago, and they're still using it. It does not work.
It's not treating the underlying problems at all, is it?
No, not at all. And they're not even trying to.
No.
And the voices they gaslight people. Like one incident comes up where they told this one schizophrenic guy, he's on heavy meds. They said, you murdered somebody, and he didn't know if he did or not.
Oh, wow.
They convinced him that he had murdered somebody, And here he is thinking, well, maybe I should turn myself in or go to the cops and find out if I murdered somebody. But if I do that and I did murder somebody, they're going to throw me back in prison. So here's this guy caught in a catch-22. Who did I murder? Do I remember murdering anybody? And then he can't do anything to resolve the situation. So here's this negative, just this sewer pit that just keeps grinding away, and they're draining him dry in the meantime. They manipulate perception. So, schizophrenic could be walking down the street and here's somebody laughs behind him and somebody tells a joke and the voices are telling, they're laughing at you. They're making fun of you, or
a lot of paranoia, isn't it?
Yeah. They want to foster that paranoia because it generates that negative emotional energy that they feed off of. They have now this is really strange. They have complete access to the schizophrenic's memory. Because these are energetic entities, there is no space, there is no time, there is no matter where they're at. So they can be in two places at the same time. They can be in the person's head and they have access to all their memories. They can bring up every rotten thing you ever did and put it in your face and start blaming you for all these things that you've done over and over. There was one where the guy borrowed a dime like 10 years ago and he never paid it back and the voices were on him. You stole that guy's dime and he didn't have any money. You were a really rotten person. Stuff like that. So they can pull up every trauma, right. Wow. And throw it in the person's face. And the most devastating I've seen of that there were two cases where they were females where they were, brutally beaten and sexually molested by this guy, this family member. And then he finally dies and they're like, oh, thank God he's gone. Thank God he's finally gone. And then at the funeral, the voices come back and say, I'm not dead. I'm still here. And remember when we did this? Do you remember when you did that? And only the dead guy and the patient would have known that. So the voices convinced them that now they're being plagued from the grave by these guys. And it's not the dead guy, it's these voices doing that. So they're very shy or sly. They're very sly. And that's horrifying. So here's this poor gal that lived a nightmare all her life. Finally, this guy's dead. She doesn't have to deal with him anymore. And then the voice comes and wow. It's worse than fiction. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's crazy. I brought this up before, pattern number 14, they tell the victim not to tell anybody else about their presence. So if somebody starts hearing voices, they know it's not normal. And the voices are telling them, well, don't tell your friends. And the ones who do tell their friends, and their friends back away like, oh, they're weird. Something's wrong with them. Don't tell your mom and dad because they'll take you to the psychiatrist and then they'll take you and lock you up in the loony bin. So they don't want the patient telling anybody about them. So of course, one of the things I tell them in my therapy sessions is tell your mom and dad what they're saying. Just open up and tell them.
It's another way of isolating these people as well, isn't it? If they're it's another way that they're isolated if they're unable to speak about their own experiences and what's happening.
Right.
And they're controlled more by entities rather than sharing and being supported by the people around them.
Right. And once the mom and dad start showing them support and accept that, the voices don't like that either. Because now they have somebody they can lean on and go tell, who are helping them and reinforcing them, helping them out. One thing's interesting too, that we found that if you put a rubber band around your wrist and they snap it when they hear the voices will shut up for 15, 20 seconds, long enough for them to repeat the 23rd Psalm, which is like punching the voices in the face. So they're able to strike back at the voices, which gives them some power. They never had any power before. They were just constantly getting beat up and kicked around. So the voices are like bullies on a playground. They knock you down. They just keep kicking unless you get up and fight back. they have to fight back. That's what I teach all my patients. They have to fight back. And I give them tools to fight back with. And then once they start fighting back, then we can go in and use the MACE energy program to get in there and start dismantling that trauma that these things feed off of, and people are completely recovering. It's happening, and the deep state friggin' psychiatric mafia is saying, oh, there is no cure. There is no cure. Nothing can be done. The only thing you can do is take our toxic meds. No, there are ways to get rid of these things, or there are ways to return to normal. It takes a lot of work. It's not easy, but it can be done.
Yeah. When these people can have their lives back and have a quality of life, how amazing.
Well, even when they start realizing that there are things they can do to fight back against the voices, there's things they can do to punch the voices in the face or kick them in the gut when they show up, that they're not helpless like the psychiatric mafia is telling them. Another facet of the voices is they're consummate liars. You can't trust or believe anything they say. Nothing. They lie about everything. And if they're not lying about it, the small percentage of time they're not lying, they're just setting the person up, getting them to trust them, and then they'll turn on them later. So the two incidents come to mind, three of them, it's three now, where the voices told the patient to gouge out their eye and that they would go away and leave them alone. They wouldn't come back. So these guys, they gouged out their eye, disfigured themselves for life. The voices came back almost immediately and said, look how stupid you are. You listen to us. What a fool you are. Now look, you're disfigured for life. You look like a freak. And then they start into them again. So this is the nature of these things. They are just very evil.
They're just mocking that person.
Yeah, I mean, they give no quarter. They're evil. They're just out and out evil. They consistently steer their victim away from anything that might generate any kind of joy or happiness. They don't want them doing things that they like to do, hobbies or hanging around people that they like, or going to movies and stuff, unless they're violent movies.
And I guess, with people doing things that they love and being around people, their energy comes up, and that is a barrier to these entities really being able to probably get in as deep and affect them, be as loud, because if your frequency is higher, you're feeling good, they're not going to be able to be in there controlling things. And it really just highlights.
Yeah,
I was just going to say,
yeah, and
it highlights to me how, if we don't control and we're not very careful in weeding out the thoughts in our own minds and, perceiving these things like what's going on, if we're not controlling and driving our own lives, very quickly there's all these external influences, whether it's the propaganda on your TV or what's going on, in your community or in your state with various corrupt politicians carrying on, or it can be completely energetic, like these entities actually coming in, dragging you down and really making decisions on your life. So, it's just such an important time to be conscious of.
Yeah, exactly.
Creating.
And if you look at what I'm telling you with these patterns, this is the exact same patterns that the mainstream media is running on all of us right now. It's the same thing. It's a macroscopic copy of these very same entities being expressed through these corrupt politicians, all over the planet right now. It's the same set of patterns. You look at it, isolate you. Look at this virus thing. 6 feet away from each other. Wear masks so you can't talk to one another. Don't gather together in groups of more than 3. It's all the same stuff. They're doing. It's the same set of patterns. They're demonic. It's a spiritual battle, and these are the patterns that these things are running.
It's so interesting to look at those patterns translating from an individual out to the masses, and absolutely we're seeing that at the moment as well.
It's the same thing. It's the same set of patterns applies to the mainstream media and the propaganda that they're putting us all under right now. And they're constantly repeating it too. So you look at You look at some of these nature films where maybe a gazelle's being chased by a lion, and the lion almost gets it and it escapes, right? And the lion goes, okay, I can't catch this guy, and the gazelle walks off and looks around. The lion's no longer there, so it just goes about its life. It starts feeding again. It's like that's gone. That
The threat's
that's
gone.
gone. I mean, the gazelle knows the lion's not around, so it doesn't worry about it. If it sees a lion, then it knows. But that's not the same with humans. It's the same over and over and over. They beat themselves over the head with it. The same thing the mainstream media is doing right now with us. You turn on any of these mainstream stations, it's fear, it's anxiety, and you're going to die, or all these people are dying, and there's a war coming. It's constant negative horse crap, constantly. It's constant propaganda, all to generate negative emotional energy, to get you scared, to think that they're going to somehow protect you when they're the wolves in sheep's clothing.
They've been using fear for such a long time to control people, and over the last few years we've just seen that amped up so very much.
Oh yeah, out of control. Then the voices can manipulate feeling without speaking. I mean, the person can be sitting around minding their own, everything's fine, and then all of a sudden there's this heavy feeling comes over them for no reason. That's them. You have to realize that they can do that, and then say, get the frick out of here. I don't want to entertain you. Be gone. They short circuit reason. So that's why a lot of these schizophrenics do stuff that is just totally incomprehensible. Why did they do that? I remember at the state hospital when I first got there, in the cafeteria, here's the grapevine news coming out. One patient had cut off his penis in another unit where one of my friends worked. And I said, hey, Ed, go ask him why he did that. So we ate lunch together that night. We met at dinner, and I said, do you ask him why he did that? And he said, yeah, I asked him. I said, well, what did he say? He said he didn't need it anymore. I said, okay. So again, boredom is bad. The worst thing you could do with a schizophrenic is let them get bored, because if you're doing that, you're allowing the voices to have 100% control over their thought processes. Anything is better than boredom, except negative movies, horror movies, that kind of stuff. And the voices are going to get them to try to watch that kind of stuff. The voices try to pass themselves off as thoughts belonging to the victim. And like I said, we're all told that all thoughts that come into our head belong to us. They want to keep it that way. Because if they're putting thoughts in your head, injecting thoughts in your mind, and you don't know that that's not you, then you're going to act on them at some point. And especially in the prison where these guys are paranoid, and the voices are telling them, that guy's going to get you. You better get him first. And even the gangsters, they will in some cases take away the medicines from some of these psychotic patients, and then start feeding them with paranoid ideation, saying, that guy in the other gang, he's going to kill you. We all heard it. You better go take care of him first. Selective forgetting. They can make the person forget. In my sessions, if the guy isn't writing down the things he needs to do, by the time the session is finished, will have forgotten 85% of what they were told. They can make them forget virtually anything.
Wow.
And the longer they've been hearing the voices, the harder it is to break that, because they're so used to it, hearing another voice there. I had one fellow we worked at for 6 months in the prison, finally got rid of his voices. He was back to normal. I remember when we did it, he was stunned. I mean, he almost fell out of his chair. He was so stunned when the voices left. They screamed and they left. And he said the silence was deafening.
Wow.
So I thought, okay, good. He's back to normal again. But finally, after, you can do it with the basic stuff, breaking up these patterns. But when the ACE energy, the MACE energy stuff is like a catalyst. It makes it so much quicker. It happens so much quicker. So I've adopted it for my patients.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody gets it, you know.
Would you,
So
just before we finish up, Jerry, because we've been chatting for ages now, it's just flown. Would you be able to explain just briefly like what the MACE method is like, just for if there's anyone listening that, you know, is either schizophrenic or knows a family member or a friend, just so they can pass that information on? Because I've heard what you've spoken about with MACE before, and I thought it was just so fantastic how it's really going through and giving people a way to do it themselves, to actually explore their patterns or programming and actually start bringing that back and releasing it.
well, what's so interesting about it is that it wasn't developed by some egghead in the universities. It wasn't developed by psychiatry or psychology or any of the social sciences. It was developed by a merchant marine ship captain who was brilliant. And he was constantly reading and educating himself, and he was trying to figure out how the mind worked. And he was reading all this philosophical stuff, and the guy was a genius. And it took him his entire career to put it together. And he realized finally that what we call the mind is the spirit. It's the spirit that does all the thinking and analyzing and talking, and all the stuff that we normally attribute to the mind belongs to the dimension of the spirit.
Wow.
And the spirit is an energetic entity. It's an energetic being that is in all of us, you know, and it is pure energy. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's like a magnetic field. It's pure, you know, it's not corrupted. So if you look at how energy flows, it flows from negative to positive. And he figured that out, that it will flow from the negative identities that people have created through trauma to the positive, and it will disperse if it's directed correctly. So what he says is that the mind is nothing but a stimulus response mechanism that creates images of where you place your attention. It doesn't think, it doesn't analyze. It's like the monitor or the monitor on a computer. You know, it just plays what is fed into it. So what he found was that these traumatic images, if they can be created, or the person can create them, so the spirit will create them. You know, so there's three components to it. It's a therapist, it's the person, and it's the person's spirit. So it's the person's spirit who will direct the therapist where to look, where the trauma is.
Amazing.
Okay. Otherwise, it can't be found. So the big issue he had and struggled with for years is, how do you find the buried trauma? You know, how do you look? Because it's buried, and it takes a lot of energy in a lot of cases to keep it buried. And he found out that if an image can be formed of this trauma and it's treated in a specific way, the spirit will absorb it, and that negative energy will return back to the person, and then the trauma will be neutralized, and it will no longer have that emotional charge to it. You know, and the person will then remember it. Instead of a horrifying experience, it'll be, okay, it's something bad that happened to me. I know it happened, but it no longer bothers me. You know,
Incredible.
it's very quick, but John Mace wrote a book. He wrote two books. One is called Energy Over Matter, and there's enough information in that to really understand how this works. There is a school in Brisbane, Australia. I think they call it the Mace Institute or Causism Institute or something like that, where they train people and therapists in how to use this stuff. And there's another book that John Mace wrote called Causism, and it'll explain enough to basically put it into use.
Amazing.
It's so it's an energetic therapy.
Yeah, finally the spirit is being considered in therapy, and look at the results. Like you said, it's quick. People are, it's not easy, but it's something that they can relatively do themselves. They know the technique.
I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe the results it got. I mean, it was just, there's nothing out there like it that I know of. Nothing. Amazing. It should be taught in the universities, but they did go to the university and they demonstrated to the one university in Australia. I don't know where it was. They went there and they demonstrated to the staff, look how this works. Look, you can see for yourself. They said, oh, well, we'll take it if we can own the patent on it. The institute went, screw you. We're not giving you a patent on that.
That's what to shut it down. It happens a lot in Australia. Yeah.
They even went to your legislatures. Where's your capital? Sydney?
Canberra is the official.
Canberra. They went up there and they showed it to some of the legislatures. It went nowhere.
I'm not surprised.
They should be teaching this in psychology classes instead of the garbage that they're teaching. Yeah. There wasn't anything very useful that I learned in 4 years of undergraduate and 4 years of graduate school that worked anywhere near as good as this, anywhere, not even in the ballpark.
Wow. It's so great to hear this coming out.
It's about time, and they're running into all this resistance. The establishment doesn't want to deal with it. They want to go on with the same garbage. Take these meds, they're making, billions of dollars selling these toxic meds, and they don't work. They don't cure anything. They cure absolutely nothing. They just suppress symptoms. And they got people believing that that's the only treatment available. I mean, these people are evil. They're evil.
They so are. And, that's why it's so important, the work that you're doing, Jerry, with raising awareness and, speaking out about these alternative methods. Because even though MACE is in Australia and I'm speaking to Jerry in the US, I've never heard of it. And, we speak to survivors and, people that have schizophrenia and need healing from trauma all the time. So I'll definitely find some links and pop them in the description box for this video as well, along with Jerry's website links and links to other videos of Jerry's for people that would like to look into anything more. And I just wanted to thank you for your time today, Jerry, and thank you for all that you're doing. Is there anything?
If you want to learn more about the voices, Sherry and I did write this.
Yes.
This will tell you all about the voices and how we determined that they were energetic parasitic entities. You can get that from Lulu Publishing, or it's on Amazon.com. It's got a 4.7 rating, which I didn't expect.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So, and you can reach me at jerrymarzinsky.com on my website. There's a lot of free information that we put out there for people that will help them a lot, that doesn't cost them nothing. There's some programs that we published on the site under articles and the blog, where if you put that to use, it's going to help. It's going to help immediately.
Amazing. Oh, thank you so much for all you do, Jerry. And like I said, I'll pop all of Jerry's links in the description for everyone.